Was Nero really insane? Or is there a more logical explanation? For nearly 2,000 years, the burning of Rome has been consigned to legend. An emperor's folly, a tyrant's whim, a symbol of decadence and madness. Yet the story has always strained against itself. Why would a ruler destroy the heart of his own power without reason? Why would he risk the fury of the people, the scorn of history for nothing but spectacle? What if Nero was not mad, but calculating? What if the fire was not madness, but method, an act of desperate governance in the face of a deeper, more dangerous revolt? By the time Nero ascended, the Roman populace was no longer the citizenry of the Republic. It was a society entangled in a web of surveillance, taxation, conscription, and bureaucratic control thicker than any city had ever known. Every grain allotment, every inheritance, every provincial tithe was recorded, tabulated, and enforced by a growing class of administrators loyal not to the people, but to the machinery of empire. The people of Rome, whether they understood it fully or only felt it in their bones, lived under the invisible weight of endless documentation, a deep state in marble and parchment. Their resentments festered, conspiracies brewed, trust between rulers and ruled decayed into suspicion and hate. Perhaps Nero, facing a people on the verge of eruption, understood that the true threat was not rebellion in the streets, but rebellion in the spirit. That the real enemy was not the Senate or the conspirators, but the silent ledger books that bound the people in chains of ink. Perhaps he saw that the only way to regain control was to burn the machinery itself, to erase the records, to sever the cords that strangled the city. If so, then the fire was not the act of an emperor fiddling as Rome burned. It was an attempt, brutal, dangerous, and ultimately catastrophic, to erase the deep structures of control before they crushed the state from within. And if so, then everything that followed, the collapse of administration, the weakening of institutions, the slow bleeding out of Roman power, was not an accident of poor leadership, but the logical aftermath of a fatal inversion. A system based on memory had lost its memory. A government built on records had destroyed its records. The empire could continue to call itself Rome, but its heart was ash. This is the theory we now advance, that Rome fell not because of decadence nor because of invasion, but because it forgot how to govern itself, and that this forgetting was neither random nor mysterious, but the predictable result of an internal rupture between people and institutions, between memory and authority. And if that is so, if mass distrust and record destruction once felled the greatest empire the world had known, what lessons must we now learn when we see new fires lit, new records erased, new institutions hollowed out in the name of reform and efficiency? Was Nero insane, or did he simply choose the path of negation? We invite you to walk with us through the evidence, to trace the hidden paths of collapse, and to decide for yourself whether the ancient fire is flickering once again at the roots of our own age. The day Augustus returned to Rome, it seemed the world itself marched behind him. In brilliant procession down the Via Sacra, through showers of roses and waves of incense, the conqueror passed between lines of gleaming soldiers and cheering citizens. Behind him, carts laden with treasures rumbled slowly, gold from Egypt, marble from Greece, silks from Parthia, captives from distant lands whose very names thrilled the crowd. But Augustus himself sat serene, his face carved like the statues that soon would fill temples bearing his name. He knew, perhaps alone among the thousands lining Rome's streets, that true power was not in gold or marble, nor even in the swords of the legions. It lay instead in the meticulous rolls of parchment carried by the quiet scribes behind the soldiers, in the invisible networks of memory and control that would soon spread from the eternal city to every village and outpost of the empire. These records were Augustus's true triumph, census lists drawn up in careful columns, taxation ledgers noting every citizen's property, maps marking the borders and populations of distant provinces. With each stroke of the scribe's pen, Rome grew stronger, more certain of itself. In Augustus's new empire, three forces became inseparable: the agencies that governed, the records that remembered, and the functionality that sustained daily life. His reforms, vast, sweeping, yet subtle, made Rome legible and thus governable. When he established the Cura Annoni, Rome's food supply flowed securely, measured and controlled. When he founded the Praetorian Guard, internal peace became as predictable as the sunrise. The empire's road network stretched outward like veins from a heart, carrying orders, tribute and protection alike. Through this precise system of administration, Rome ceased to be merely a city or even an empire. It became an ordered universe, held together not by the sword alone, but by the invisible threads of bureaucratic coherence. It was not freedom Augustus offered his people, but peace, not liberty, but stability. In exchange for the loss of their old republican independence, Romans found themselves safe, fed, entertained, and thoroughly documented. The tabularia, the state archives, housed in sturdy vaults near the Forum, filled to bursting with endless scrolls detailing every aspect of imperial life. Augustus's reign was the triumph of memory over chaos, of agency over discord, of functionality over ruin, and for a generation, Rome prospered in the precise equilibrium he had forged. In many ways, Augustus's Rome echoes in the post-war America of the mid-20th century, another golden age of meticulous organization, boundless optimism, and subtle, pervasive administration. Just as Romans saw roads stretching to the horizon, Americans watched highways unspooling toward suburbs. Rome had the Cura Annoni, America had supermarkets overflowing with abundance. Romans praised their legions' precision. Americans marveled at factories turning out flawless rows of gleaming automobiles. Both societies trusted their systems, perhaps a bit blindly, to ensure a stable, secure future. Yet, hidden within that security was the quiet tightening of a bureaucratic grip. For Romans, just as for post-war Americans, peace and prosperity came at the price of deepening administrative control. Census rolls became tax assessments. Suburban developments became mortgage ledgers. The comforts of stability rested uneasily upon the fine lines drawn by unseen clerks. And with each passing year, this machinery grew heavier, more distant and more vulnerable to the corrosive forces of corruption and resentment. Thus, Augustus's Rome, like America's nostalgic golden age, rested precariously upon a triad of administrative power: control, corruption, and collapse. In the short term, absolute administrative power offers peace and security. In the longer term, that same administrative power, unchecked and unseen, inevitably turns inward upon itself, breeding corruption, eroding trust, sowing the seeds of collapse. Rome would soon learn how quickly security could become oppression, how quickly agency could become tyranny, how quickly meticulous record-keeping could become tools of exploitation. Augustus himself might not have seen clearly where his careful order would lead, yet in his triumph, the pinnacle of Rome's imperial power, lay the subtle beginnings of its unravelling. If Augustus had woven Rome into a seamless tapestry of order, control, and administrative coherence, the emperors who followed tugged steadily at its threads until the fabric began to tear. Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius did not simply inherit an empire, they inherited a delicate equilibrium, carefully balanced but fragile. Each man disrupted that balance differently, unravelling trust in distinct yet interconnected ways, each paralleling modern anxieties and conceptions about state power, welfare and bureaucracy, and each prompting reactions that echoed far beyond their times. The Senate chamber stood silent as the doors opened slowly. Tiberius, pale and expressionless, entered surrounded by men whose names no senator knew, faces half-hidden, voices hushed. A whispered accusation had been enough. One senator, respected yesterday, vanished today. Eyes turned away, breath stilled as parchments bearing charges, treason, conspiracy, corruption, passed from unseen hands. It was not law that filled the hall now, but fear, the quiet, creeping dread that the state they served had become their enemy, and that no one could ever truly know who watched, who listened, and who recorded each quiet betrayal. Augustus had built an administrative state founded on precision, stability, and confidence. Tiberius, suspicious by nature and uneasy with power, transformed these institutions into instruments of suspicion. Under his rule, Rome's governing agencies took on new roles: secret informers, shadowy trials, arbitrary accusations. Roman citizens found themselves subject to surveillance, investigation, and judgment by faceless bureaucrats whose loyalty was to the emperor alone. The Senate shrank in significance. its deliberations overshadowed by whispered denunciations in the imperial court. In Roman streets and marketplaces, paranoia replaced civic pride. Trust was replaced by uncertainty. The government no longer seemed protective but predatory, a secretive deep state, inscrutable, untouchable, and above all dangerous. This fear, once kindled, lingered long after Tiberius's death, altering the people's relationship to their government permanently. Modern parallels are stark. Agencies once intended to protect and provide security, Hoover's FBI, the CIA, came to symbolize for many an entrenched power working beyond public oversight. Like Rome's frightened populace under Tiberius, modern citizens came to regard these institutions not merely as enforcers of law, but as agents of control and manipulation. Regardless of their intent or genuine service, the lasting perception bred suspicion and resentment, fueling cycles of distrust that endure today. The mob pressed close, jostling for position beneath the hot midday sun. They had come expecting bread, perhaps silver coins, something tangible to carry back to their crowded homes. Instead, they watched bewildered as Caligula laughed wildly atop a lavish platform, showering gold into the Tiber, tossing handfuls of grain into the mud, as if Rome's riches meant nothing. "Feast, citizens!" he shouted mockingly. "It's yours, isn't it?" The murmurs of confusion hardened into anger, their empty stomachs echoing the insult they felt sharply now. Their emperor cared nothing for them or the empire, only for spectacle, for the cruelty of squandered wealth and the humiliation of those who watched helplessly from below. After Tiberius's secretive reign, Caligula exploded onto the Roman stage, openly and flamboyantly contemptuous of Rome's institutions. He turned the machinery of governance into a grotesque spectacle. Massive fortunes were wasted on extravagant games, useless monuments, and lavish displays that benefited no one but Caligula himself. The grain supply, public festivals, and civic distributions, functions vital to social stability, degenerated into tools of personal vanity, drained of public purpose. Romans watched helplessly as the resources of their state were squandered. Their anger grew, not merely at the emperor's personal cruelty, but at the entire structure of public provisioning, which now appeared wasteful and corrupt. What Augustus had established to sustain the empire, Caligula rendered absurd, wasteful, and self-serving. In modern eyes, Caligula's Rome echoes sharply in perceptions of the welfare state. Like Roman citizens bitterly watching Caligula's extravagance, many modern taxpayers came to perceive government programs as squandering their wealth, distributing resources without visible benefit, and undermining self-reliance and productivity. The perception itself, whether grounded in reality or exaggerated by spectacle, generated profound backlash, turning welfare from a symbol of compassion into one of perceived waste, dependence, and resentment. Claudius bent close over the towering stacks of parchment, eyes squinting, hands trembling slightly as he unrolled yet another decree. Scribbled notes covered the margins, lines crossed out and rewritten by unseen bureaucrats. An endless stream of clerks shuffled documents back and forth, whispering, arguing, contradicting each other in hushed voices. Somewhere deep in this labyrinthine palace stood Rome's memory, the true history of empire. But it was drowning now, beneath an ocean of redundant words, a forest of conflicting orders. The emperor sighed, bewildered himself by the sheer weight of his reforms, not realizing that with every new decree he issued, Rome's coherent voice faded further, dissolving into confusion. Claudius inherited chaos from Caligula, and in his earnestness to restore stability, he multiplied the complexity of administration to dizzying proportions. Driven by a scholar's zeal, he created countless new offices and agencies, each layered upon the old, until Rome's administration became a dense thicket of overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting directives. Freedmen and slaves ascended swiftly within this sprawling bureaucracy, their loyalties uncertain, their competence often questioned, their authority resented by traditional elites. This proliferation of bureaucratic complexity eroded Rome's administrative memory itself. Records multiplied beyond comprehension, inconsistencies abounded, and corruption flourished. Even citizens who respected Roman authority could no longer understand or navigate it. Rome's administrative web, once a marvel of efficient control, became instead a morass of inefficiency, redundancy, and frustration. The modern parallel is unmistakable. The bureaucracy today remains one of the most potent targets of public resentment, seen as a vast, faceless, inefficient entity that drains resources, obscures accountability, and frustrates ordinary life. Much as Romans once railed against the endless complexity under Claudius, contemporary citizens often blame bureaucracy for failures of governance, irrespective of the genuine need for detailed administration in complex societies. Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius did not merely weaken the empire individually, they formed a fatal triad, each ruler's distortions amplifying those of the others. Tiberius's transformation of state agencies into instruments of surveillance and oppression planted seeds of suspicion so deep that the Roman people began to see the government itself as their oppressor. When Caligula then turned state functionality into an absurd spectacle of waste, he exploited and intensified that suspicion, converting public resentment into outright contempt. Citizens who had feared their government now also despised its extravagance. Finally, Claudius's overwhelming bureaucratic expansions undermined the empire's administrative coherence, turning suspicion and resentment into outright alienation. Romans who already mistrusted and resented their rulers now felt powerless and confused, trapped within a machinery of governance they neither understood nor respected. These three destructive transformations, fear of a secretive deep state, resentment of perceived welfare state abuses, and alienation from an incomprehensible bureaucracy, became self-reinforcing, each magnifying the societal impact of the others. Suspicion bred resentment, resentment bred alienation, and alienation bred greater suspicion still. Thus the triad of Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius quietly but irreversibly destroyed Rome's foundational trust, leaving behind a society exhausted, cynical, and primed for a collapse already waiting in the wings. In such a world, it took no more than a single spark, one act of crisis or desperation, to set the empire ablaze. Nero did not begin Rome's unravelling, he merely entered a stage already set, a city already trembling on the edge of ruin. In the final years before the fire, the streets of Rome boiled with a kind of quiet fury. It was not the open defiance of riots or civil war, but something deeper, heavier, the sullen hatred of a people who no longer believed that their rulers governed for their good. In every quarter, the common people muttered about the tax collectors who squeezed them dry, the judges who sold verdicts like wares, the bureaucrats who vanished into marble halls with their pleas and petitions unanswered. These agencies of the empire, once trusted arms of Roman order, were seen now as monstrous machines, grinding the lifeblood out of honest citizens. The archives that housed the empire's memory became, in the public eye, symbols of their own enslavement. Every scroll catalogued a debt, every ledger a claim against them, every register a rope tightening slowly around their necks. The idea that the records existed to guarantee rights and protect property had long been lost. Records meant taxes owed, judgments rendered, penalties waiting to descend. The common citizen no longer saw his name etched into the scrolls as a mark of belonging to a greater civic project. He saw it as the branding of a beast bound for sacrifice. Even the tangible functionality of empire, grain supplies, aqueducts, public games, was recast in bitterness. Bread was no gift, but a bribe. Roads were not the arteries of Roman greatness, but the means by which armies and tax collectors spread oppression. Courts were not guardians of justice, but engines of confiscation and exile. The very organs of Rome's strength, designed under Augustus to serve and unify, had curdled into sources of resentment, objects of scorn. Through this mass perception, the triadic system inverted. The agencies became oppressors, the records became chains, and the functions of empire became acts of predation. Each element fed into the others. The more the agencies enforced, the more records they created. The more records existed, the more enforcement was demanded. The more functionality was delivered, the more it appeared a cover for deeper exploitation. A living feedback loop of alienation thrived in the shadows of Rome's marble forums and glittering monuments. This alienation was not imposed by Nero or by some new oppressive decree. It emerged naturally from decades of erosion of legitimacy, erosion of civic meaning, erosion of trust. The collapse was seeded in the hearts of the people long before it was reflected in fire and ruin. They did not merely resent the emperor, they resented the very fact of being administered at all. The hatred was so profound that no reform could reach it, no apology could repair it. And in that hatred, in that slow rolling collapse of administrative legitimacy, lay a hunger for destruction. It was not the hunger of madmen or criminals, but of ordinary men who had ceased to believe that the machinery of governance could ever serve them again. The people no longer wished to mend Rome's institutions, they wished to see them fall. When modern citizens today celebrate the shuttering of federal offices, the erasure of regulatory records, the retreat of administrative oversight, they walk a path already well trodden. Then, as now, the glee at dismantling bureaucracy masks a deeper truth, that it is not the machinery alone that is being cast aside, but the very memory of shared governance and, with it, the fragile conditions of civic order. On the night when the fire began, the winds carried smoke and ash across the city like an omen. Flames leapt from rooftop to rooftop, consuming wood, canvas, even stone itself in the heat's fury. The people, dazed and desperate, filled the streets. Some fought the flames, others fled before them. But many stood and watched with a strange, dark satisfaction as the city's heart turned to cinders. It was not the temples they cheered for. It was not the homes. It was the burning of something less visible but far more hated, the destruction of the empire's chains. Word spread quickly that the fire had reached the bureaucratic districts, the offices where taxes were recorded, where debts were preserved, where the rulings of faceless judges were carved into dusty scrolls. These places, the people whispered, were falling. Fire devoured the tabularia, the tax records, the court archives. In those towering infernos, generations of obligations, censuses, fines and penalties were undone in minutes. Memory itself, imperial memory, blazed and crackled into the night sky. Whether Nero himself ordered the fire, merely allowed it to spread, or exploited it afterward, hardly mattered to the people gathered in Rome's blackened streets. For many, the destruction of records was not a catastrophe, but a catharsis. In the collapse of the empire's memory, they saw a liberation from burdens too long carried. Without archives, how could debts be collected? Without registries, how could fines be levied? Without records, how could the empire's invisible hands continue to close around their lives? The logic of destruction became self-perpetuating. Agencies housed within the burned districts could not function without records. Without enforcement, new taxes could not be properly assessed, old judgments could not be executed, logistical operations floundered. As functionality collapsed, so too did the need for agencies to even pretend to legitimacy. The loss of memory cascaded through the system, not as a single act of annihilation, but as an unfolding paralysis. Rome had been a living body. Now it was a body without nerves. The triadic structure that had supported Rome's governance, agency, memory, function, was broken at every point simultaneously. And the people did not mourn. They celebrated. The flames that stripped the city's skyline were mirrored by a fire in the hearts of its citizens, a fire of hope that they might live freer without the slow strangulation of bureaucratic control. The idea that an empire could govern without records, without administration, without centralized coercion, flickered into being, and once sparked, it spread like the fire itself. In modern times, when initiatives like Doge move to dismantle oversight, erase databases, sever the continuity of institutional memory, their supporters often cheer. They imagine themselves throwing off invisible chains, destroying corrupt edifices, regaining a purer, freer form of life. They do not yet see the deeper price, the slow unspooling of the structures that hold collective life together. In Rome, that price would come. But in those first days of ash and ruin, the people smiled at the flames. They believed they were free. The flames had long since guttered out, leaving Rome a blackened skeleton of its former grandeur. In the beginning, there had been a strange exultation. The hated tax offices were gone, the decrees and ledgers that had pressed so heavily on the common citizen were ash. For a fleeting moment it had seemed that liberation had been achieved, not in rhetoric but in smoke. But soon grim realities asserted themselves. Without the tax records, the imperial treasury could not properly collect revenue. Provinces unmoored from the systematic assessments once enforced by meticulous scrolls sent tribute late, short, or not at all. Without property registries, disputes over land and inheritance flared into violent confrontations, each side wielding forged documents or vague recollections in place of law. Without military rolls, soldiers went unpaid, their loyalty eroding with every missed stipend. Without judicial archives, the courts floundered, unable to adjudicate cases fairly or consistently. Contracts, marriages, inheritances, everything that had once been secured by the invisible web of Roman documentation now dissolved into uncertainty and fraud. The city itself began to fracture. Black markets flourished. Criminal gangs filled the power vacuum left by the disintegration of civic authority. Grain shipments, already sporadic from the chaos of the fire, now failed entirely in some districts. Bread grew scarce, prices soared, families starved. At first the people clung stubbornly to their illusions. Perhaps the suffering was temporary. Perhaps a new order would arise, free from the bureaucratic rot they had burned away. But week after week, as hunger deepened, as disputes turned to bloodshed, as basic functions of life crumbled around them, a darker realization took hold. The destruction of the records had not freed them. It had unmade the only system that could sustain them. The triadic collapse was complete. Agencies, stripped of authority and coherence, operated blindly or not at all. The memory of Rome, the records of law, property, rights, was gone, leaving only confusion and anarchy. Functionality, which the people had once taken for granted, disintegrated visibly before their eyes. This realization did not come all at once. It spread like a slow sickness, sapping the energy of the forums, the temples, the markets. It poisoned public trust more deeply than any corruption had before. People began to suspect not merely the government, but each other. Without records, there could be no verification. Without verification, no trust. Without trust, no society. The public mood darkened. Resentment turned outward. If Rome was starving, it must be someone's fault. If the courts failed, if the bread did not come, if debts could no longer be enforced or forgiven, someone had sabotaged the city's soul. It could not be blamed on the fire alone. It could not be blamed on fate. It had to be an enemy. The people did not need Nero to invent an enemy for them. He merely pointed to a target already marked by fear, isolation, and difference. In modern times, we see similar patterns wherever administrative collapse breeds public disillusionment. When systems falter and everyday life degrades, the instinct is not to examine systemic causes or collective failures. It is to find someone else, some other, to blame: migrants, minorities, outsiders, those who already stand outside the traditional structures of belonging. Rome's collapse of functionality was not abstract. It was felt day by day in every missed payment, every empty table, every street fight over disputed claims. It was a collapse that no rhetoric could conceal, and it was the spark that turned a suffering people already wounded into a weapon that the emperor could easily wield against those least able to defend themselves. As the embers cooled in the ruins of Rome, the city's unease deepened into a gnawing fear. The promise of renewal, which many had seen in the destruction of the imperial archives, had curdled into disillusionment. Food shortages grew worse. Lawlessness spread. What had been celebrated as liberation from oppression now revealed itself as something far more dangerous. The collapse of the world's most intricate system of order, without anything rising to replace it. But the Roman people, facing the chaos they had helped unleash, did not turn inward. They did not ask whether their own hatred of administration had doomed them. They did not ask whether the emperor's negligence had sown their misery. They looked instead for someone to blame, someone different enough, isolated enough, despised enough to bear the full weight of their fear and rage. The Christians were ready-made scapegoats, not simply because of their faith, but because they stood at the intersection of every mistrusted identity. They were religious outsiders, refusing to honor Rome's gods, rejecting the public rights that bound Roman society together. They were immigrants and descendants of immigrants, hailing from Judea, Syria and the eastern provinces, speaking foreign tongues, carrying foreign customs, living in close-knit enclaves that set them apart from native Roman populations. And they were overwhelmingly poor, drawn from the ranks of freedmen, tradesmen and slaves, far from the wealth and patronage networks that offered some protection from state violence. This triad, different beliefs, immigrant origins and poverty, marked them as a people apart. Not Roman, not loyal, not safe. And so, when Nero cast blame upon them for the Great Fire, the accusation fit perfectly into the public's need for a villain. The crowds embraced the lie because it spared them the unbearable truth, that their own rage and their own emperor's ambition had torn Rome apart. The persecution that followed was brutal and public. Christians were hunted, tortured and executed not in secret, but in spectacles designed to reassert the empire's dominance. New administrative structures were built from the ashes, but they were designed not to serve citizens but to monitor them, to divide them, to remind them of the price of dissent. Agencies now compiled lists not of civic obligations but of suspected disloyalties. Records were no longer tools of memory, but weapons of accusation. Functionality was reduced to the raw exercise of terror. In sacrificing the Christians, Rome tried to sacrifice its own guilt. It tried to erase the truth of its collapse by creating a more convenient narrative. That outsiders had destroyed the city, that betrayal had burned the archives, that purification through blood would restore lost greatness. But it was a lie, and lies, however violently enforced, cannot rebuild a fallen world. Today, the pattern repeats. Across the world, in moments of administrative decay, economic despair and cultural fragmentation, immigrant populations are blamed. Not because they caused the collapse, but because they are visible, different and vulnerable. Their beliefs are unfamiliar, their ties to national myths are weak, their poverty makes them easy targets. Walls are built, borders are sealed, deportations increase, camps fill. And always, the claim is the same, that the problems of a failing system are the fault of those least able to defend themselves. It is not unique to any one country. It is not new. It is the oldest temptation of all. Rome chose that path. It bought a few more years of sullen, bloody order, but it never recovered the memory it had destroyed, nor the trust it had lost. So was Nero mad? It is the question history returns to, again and again, unable to look away from the flames. Was the emperor delusional, fiddling while Rome burned? Or was he something far more unsettling, rational within a collapsing world? When Nero ascended, the bond between emperor and people had already thinned to a thread. Rome's institutions still functioned in form, but not in spirit. The people no longer offered loyalty as citizens, they yielded only what fear or necessity demanded. Yet even in this estranged state they remained essential. Their taxes fed the imperial machine. Their tribute upheld the legions. Their obedience underwrote the emperor's very survival. Nero understood this with a clarity that perhaps none of his predecessors possessed. Power did not rest in marble statues or gilded palaces. It rested in the hands of a sullen, resentful population. The same hands that toiled in fields, traded in markets, paid the endless taxes inscribed in the scrolls of the tabularia. Without their compliance, the empire would not simply weaken, it would starve. Yet compliance was rotting from within. Each tax collected deepened hatred. Each levy and census marked not belonging, but subjugation. Rome's administrative triumph, its detailed memory of every debt, every field, every birth and death, had inverted into a visible chain, binding a restless populace to an empire they no longer loved. Nero faced a grim arithmetic. He needed the people's taxes to survive, but each act of collection poisoned the well of loyalty further. The harder the state grasped, the more its subjects withdrew in spirit, if not yet in body. In this trap, Nero saw a brutal opportunity. If the machinery of records could be destroyed, if the ledgers that sustained endless obligations could be burned away, the people might briefly be reconciled to their ruler. Freed from the hated debts and censuses, they might see in him not an oppressor, but a liberator. Their hostility might soften, Their labour might resume, no longer for an abstract empire, but for a ruler who had cut the cords of their enslavement. The fire, then, was not only an act against the state's machinery, it was an act aimed at reclaiming the people themselves, their loyalty, their energy, their taxes. By destroying the memory of their obligations, Nero gambled that he could renew the real foundation of imperial power, the material productivity of the masses, freely given, not resentfully extracted. It was a desperate wager. The machinery burned, the obligations collapsed into ash, but the trust that had once bound ruler and ruled was already too far gone. The people did not offer new loyalty and gratitude. They celebrated the destruction, but withheld the submission Nero needed most. They cheered the fall of the tax records, but did not rush to pay new taxes. They rejoiced in the loss of oversight, but did not rally to rebuild what they had helped destroy. The emperor, still seated in splendor, still garbed in purple, found himself ruling a hollow empire, a state without memory, a treasury without revenue, a people without faith. In the end, Nero needed the people more than they needed him, and when he reached for them, he found only ash between his fingers.